Hi, and welcome to the next of our support sessions for getting people back into the workplace following the recent lockdown. First of all, I just want to welcome Adam Young from ARCO today. He'll be taking the first part of the session today, and we'll be talking a little bit about what they've done and things that you need to think about when you're looking at becoming COVID secure going forward. This is funded by the Grow My SME programme by the Humber Growth Hub, and there is further support for any businesses through that programme going forward. Today, the session, as I say, will be first starting off with Adam, who will be talking about their side of things, and most of you will know ARCO, I'm sure, and we'll be looking at sort of what you need to do and then talking about returning. I'll be taking that a little bit further going forward. I'll be talking a bit more about risk assessments, how to complete a risk assessment, what you need to do, as well as some of the government advice for, in particular, for construction, delivery and working from vehicles, and what the government documentation currently says that ideally you need to be looking at putting in place. We want this to be as interactive as we possibly can make it in one of these systems and one of these situations. So we do encourage as many questions as we possibly can get. And you should see a little questions button. If you put your questions in there when they come to you, that will pop up and we'll come and answer them at the end of each of our sessions. I do suggest if you've got the questions, put them in as soon as you think about them, because there is a little bit of a delay in them coming through, and it just means that we can answer them as and when they come through and at the end of each of our sessions. So as I say, put them in as soon as you think about them, and we'll look at those. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Adam, who will take the first part of the session today. Adam.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak to you today. Let's see if I can make the slides move. Yeah. So I'm going to tell you a bit about what ARCO have been doing and how we're supporting our customers through the COVID-19 period. I'll start off, I think, by just presuming you know who ARCO are. Probably many of you drive past the big shed on the A63. You see it on the left there, lit up in an NHS blue a couple of weeks back as we were doing the Thursday night clapping for the NHS thing. Well, what you may not know is that over the last few months, we've really pivoted our business around. We have been doing an enormous quantity of work supporting the frontline response to COVID. On the right hand side, actually, you see that's a photo from China, and the plane behind is a 747, which is being loaded up with face masks. That plane actually landed a couple of weeks back, and it had 14 million face masks on board. Since then, we've had more planes arrive. In total, we'll have had about 140 million face masks arrive just over the last few weeks. So we've been really busy, and that the shed on the left has been packed to the rafters with PPE to help the nation's response to COVID. And we're kind of moving on now to helping those businesses that are restarting and getting back to some semblance of normality as the lockdown starts to lift. So in terms of content I'm going to cover off today, I'll just quickly talk about managing the risk and the risk assessment process, about getting social distancing right, cleaning the workplace. There's loads of questions that people have at the moment around PPE, and most especially around masks. What's the right kind of mask to be wearing? I'll touch on hand hygiene and what you should be doing there, and I'll finish with just a bit of a warning about some of the rubbish that's out there and how to avoid falling into a trap of buying dodgy kit. Okay, so firstly, managing the risk of COVID, and as you go back to work, the standard risk assessment process that you will be well accustomed to in your businesses is perfectly well suited to helping you to make your workplace safe with this new hazard. It's structured in a way people are used to using it in a way that just works perfectly well. And we'd recommend there's 4 steps. You need to assess the risk, you need to manage the risk. Really important that you communicate your findings with your colleagues, and over time you keep it updated and review your progress against that risk assessment and how well you're managing the risk. I say that the communication is really important because many people returning to work after a furlough period will be feeling really nervous. And actually, I've put on the right-hand side of the page there so a little document that the government have put together to help you to communicate with your colleagues about the steps that you've gone through to make the workplace safe, to help them to come back without needing to worry about catching COVID. And I'll just mention down on the bottom left, all of the content that I'm going to show today is included on our website. If you want to go and have a look there, it's all there for free to download. But hopefully some really helpful stuff there for you. So the first thing you need to do, conduct your risk assessment and do it collaboratively. Do it in consultation with unions if you have them, or with workers' representatives. Okay, so once your risk assessment's done, you'll need to think about social distancing, and all of these solutions will be unique to your business, the way you operate. Whether you're kind of working from a vehicle, on a construction site, doing deliveries, working in a warehouse, whatever those places are, people will congregate in different ways. People will come together in pinch points in different ways, and you'll need to think about where those are. And how you can change your operating processes to keep people apart from each other. As you do that, there's on the right here a little infographic that you can download just to kind of prompt you through the key places to look out for. And we have a range of signs and posters that are available if you want to come and have a look at some of those. All printed with the 2-meter guidance, and I know there's a lot of debate at the moment around whether that 2 meters could come down. Many other countries have come down from 2 meters over time. We'll have an awful lot of poster and sign reprinting to do if that does happen. But right now it's 2 meters that you need to keep your colleagues away from each other. So you'll need to think about that. How are you going to change your processes, put the signage up, put the barrier systems in place, all those kind of things that you need to do to achieve social distancing. You also need to think about how your workplace needs to be cleaned differently in the past. Word on here you might not recognise, fomites. So fomites are all the places where the virus can sit and where you can catch it from. List on the left of the kind of places you need to think about. Doorknobs and banisters are probably the worst candidates for these. But have a think about your cleaning regime and how it might need to adapt. It depends on the amount of traffic you have, how frequently those places are being touched by people, and how many people in each environment. But you will need to put in place a regime to keep the workplace clean. Even for kind of vehicles, if you're out and about using those, thinking about how you're going to keep those clean, or really limit the number of people who have access to those vehicles. And again, if you need some advice on this, if you need to know about what are the appropriate products to be using, if you want to disinfect, what's the right concentration of chemicals to be using for cleaning, and what kind of regime do you need to put in place? Just click on the link here, which I think is included at the end of the presentation as well. So you'll be able to take a look at that. So you've now got a clean workplace and a regime that's kind of maintaining that in place. You may need to think about PPE, and this has been just an incredible period for us as we try and respond to what has become almost infinite demand for some of these products at a time when supply has been really limited. And if you were a user of PPE before the lockdown, you may be coming back to find that some of the products that you previously used are in really short supply. So I've put some of the worst candidates up on the screen here. So P2 and P3 3 masks, disposable coveralls, nitrile gloves. There's many more as well that have challenging stock positions, but these are some of the most extreme ones. And we've been battling pretty hard to source supplies of these products and bring them in. But often, you take the nitrile gloves. A lot of those come from countries in the Far East that have been on complete lockdown, and the factories have been shut. And whilst the government today is looking pretty hard about how some of the production for these critical items can be reshored back to the UK, right now that just isn't the case. So you will need to look at what PPE you need. I'd really recommend that you kind of pick up the phone or take a look at the website to find out what's available. And if you can't get what you were previously using or needed, then just have a conversation with us or whoever your supplier is, and make sure you find yourself a suitable alternative. And masks are specifically a challenge at the moment. You've probably seen that there are all sorts of masks being advertised for sale at the moment. You can find them in the kind of the bargain bin at the supermarket when you go in. You can find them from your usual suppliers. But there's lots of different types of these and different codes that can be pretty confusing. And a real word of warning here: you could get pretty confused by this stuff and definitely buy the wrong product at the moment. So we have produced an expert advice sheet. You see it on the right to help you to make sure that you are buying the right product. Your risk assessment should be telling you what you need. And if you are protecting yourself against hazards that are kind of part of the way you do business, then you need to be thinking about respirators and preventing those whatever hazards those are getting into people's lungs. If it's about social distancing though, and keeping everybody safe from each other, you need to be thinking about face masks, which is more about kind of catching the virus on the way out if someone should be infected and in your workplace. And there's all these different codes, FFP1, P2, P3 are maybe the ones that if you use them in the past, you might be used to those. Those are kind of increasing levels of complexity and ability to filter out the virus or bacteria or particles. But newer ones you might not have heard of, type 1, type 2, type 2R, they kind of describe the more medical masks that you see on the left. And then some others, N95, KF94, KN95, these are foreign codes. So N95 is American, KF is Korean, KN is Chinese. So simple advice on these: don't buy them. You've probably had these advertised to you. You've probably seen them in kind of Google ads or Facebook ads. The KN95 in particular is absolute shocking quality. There's recently been a warning from the HSE about these, and my advice really is just do not go anywhere near those. Really, N95 and KF94, don't go near them. You should be looking for a CE mark. That can be a guarantee. If you follow some of the other advice I'll give you later, but certainly don't buy the foreign products. There are, as I understood from yesterday, there are now 25,000 Chinese factories producing face masks. Enormous number of them have spun up, and many of them are really poor quality. So again, the link on the bottom if you need some more advice on what's the right product to choose. But if you are just thinking about social distancing, either a type 2 face mask, you don't need the type 2R, those are for clinical uses, so a type 2 face mask, or a face covering, which is not a mask. You can make them at home. I actually wouldn't recommend that from a kind of work point of view, but you can buy some pretty decent quality face coverings now for not too much money. So next, just talking about hand hygiene. So before the lockdown, we were all getting used to the advice on how to wash our hands properly and doing it frequently. You need to make sure as you come back to work that you've got this really well trained into your staff, that you've got the right signage up to remind them. But also, if kind of hand washing isn't possible in all the locations that you need, you may need to think about sanitizing, user sanitizers. And then you need to really make sure that you're using the right product. There are lots of alcohol-free products on the market. They, I think, pretty likely don't work against COVID. So you need to be looking out for 60% alcohol content or more. And getting that product in the right place around your workplace or in vehicles that people are traveling around in. Again, just click on the link for some more detail if you need it. I should have passed there, that hand hygiene piece, it is the single most important thing that you can do to keep your colleagues safe. Then the final point I was going to make, final slide for today, is just about fake and non-compliant PPE. So I've already talked about low quality PPE, but worse than that, there is an awful lot of fake stuff on the market. It's pretty hard to tell the difference. And it's really hard to tell the difference with something that's just isn't compliant, because there's a bit of documentation work to do. What I would remind you is that in terms of kind of liability, whose job is it to ensure that the PPE that your colleagues are wearing is compliant, is suitable, is fit for purpose? That is down to you. And there's some steps that you can take to reassure yourself that you're buying decent stuff. Firstly, when you buy it, to whoever you choose to buy this stuff from, you should ask to see the CE certificate, and you should ask for a declaration of conformity. And if your supplier can't supply you with those things, there's a big red light there. Don't go anywhere near them if they can't supply those. Unfortunately, that's not quite enough, because there's an awful lot of fake documents going around at the moment. So you need to check it, and unfortunately 10 things that you need to check. So some quite complex advice here. We have put together, again, another expert advice sheet, which is free to access on our website. Go and download it. It'll take you through the 10 points that you need to check, just to reassure yourself that this is decent quality product, and it's going to do what it says it's going to do. I think one of the worst situations we're starting to see is people buying some of those KN95 masks, using them because they haven't been able to get hold of the P2 masks that they've had in the past, and kind of regular workplace hazards, be that, I don't know, asbestos or chemicals or construction dust, all those kind of things that you might be using masks to protect yourselves against. These KN95s are not going to help you with that. So please make sure that you're buying from a reputable supplier, whoever you choose, and that you go through these steps to reassure yourself that you're buying good quality PPE. Okay, that was all I was going to cover today. I'll hand back control.
Thank you very much, Adam. Some really interesting, really useful information there, especially when it comes down to some of the masks, and it's quite a minefield there. And I think that's shown with the questions that we've started having come in, actually. So I've got a few questions that have come in. The first one is, what should a compliant mask look like? Should it have any sort of markings on it to show its compliance?
It's well, the key thing to look out for is the CE mark. So you should be able to see the CE mark actually on the box. If you can't see one of those on the box that you bought, then that's pretty likely not allowed to be sold in this country. So that's probably the main thing that you need to see. All the other stuff that you need to do comes with the extra documentation that you need to ask for, so isn't necessarily included on the box. and won't be included in the box either. So you need to ask for it at the point that you buy it.
Thank you very much. The next one is, what is the difference between a social barrier mask and a medical mask? I've seen both advertised, and I understand that neither protect the wearer.
That's correct. Yep. So they're designed to protect the people around the wearer from the virus that might be coming out of them if they were infected. Really the only difference for the medical masks is that the type 2R that I was describing has splash resistant properties. So they're designed to be used when there's a significant risk of aerosol. So if you're putting someone on a ventilator or working around a lot of people who are kind of likely to be infected, they stop splashes going through the mask. But yeah, the kind of social distancing mask, all they're doing basically is just catching droplets as you exhale them. There's no seal, no seal around the face. So when you breathe in, anything that's in the air is going to go in. But it is important to get that right, because you do see. Just a few days ago, I saw someone in the supermarket queue, and they were wearing probably a mask that they'd kind of been found in their shed, and it had an exhalation valve on it. Now that makes breathing easier, but basically when you exhale, it just opens up and lets everything flood out. So that's absolutely no use whatsoever to the unfortunate folk who are standing around you. And if you're infected, you're just going to breathe the virus out onto them.
Yeah. Another question about documentation. My supplier has supplied me with a declaration. However, it isn't in English. Is that something I should be worried about?
Absolutely. So the law says it has to be provided in a language. Well, it has to be provided in English. So that they really shouldn't be doing that. It's their job to get that translated for you. If I were you, I'd send them back.
Yeah, so I suppose that would be an indication that it isn't up to full standard, or it might be not compliant in some way, I guess. It's
the supplier. The supplier also has an obligation to ensure that the products that they're selling are compliant, and that declaration of conformity has been filled in correctly. And unless they are pretty fluent in Chinese or Korean or whatever language it is, if it hasn't been translated, then how on earth do they know that what they're selling you is the right thing? So I'd send it back.
Definitely, yeah. The final one we've got on at the moment is I'm very confused about the difference between FFP1, FFP2, and FFP3, and which ones I should be buying. Okay. Any advice on the differences between the three different standards there?
Yeah, so the main difference between P1, P2, P3 is the degree of filtration that they achieve. So the P3s have the highest level of filtration and filter out really, really tiny particles, and they're designed to be used in really high hazard environments, so where the particles are very small. P1s are really only kind of for dust and nuisance, so they have a very kind of open mesh to them. So in most industrial environments, P2 and P3 are what's recommended. One challenge at the moment is P3s are pretty hard to come by. So there's not a lot of them around, and the ones that are around are pretty pricey. But that's the difference. Your risk assessments should help you to understand what's the particle that's in the air, and what kind of which kind of mask you need to filter that out. And if you're not sure what the right one is, then you can just pick up the phone, and we can kind of help to give you some advice.
Thank you very much. That's all for the questions that we've got come up so far. As I say, some really detailed information, certainly some detailed answers. I think hopefully that's helped a lot of people, especially when it comes down to PPE, because it is quite a minefield, especially at the moment with so many different different sort of standards that people are looking into, and with the, I'm going to say, the standards which are coming onto the market, which are, as we said, not necessarily compliant, so confusing matters going forward. But as I say, thank you very much, Adam. It's been really useful information and been really great, and we certainly appreciate the information that you've given. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to take the next part of the session, and I'm basically just going to build upon what Adam said, go through it in a little bit more detail and look a little bit more about what you need to do to make your workplace COVID secure. So just to introduce myself, first of all, I'm Peter Daniel. I'm a senior business advisor for Blue Orchid, and I'm an NEBOSH accredited health and safety advisor. My background, I've had my own business. I've worked in construction myself. That's where I started, sort of when I left university, and that I started in construction. I started in that industry. So hopefully what I'm going to be giving you here is very practical advice, and I want to look at risk assessments from a very practical point of view, because my theory here, and the theory that is echoed through a lot of things like HSE and the enforcing bodies, are if a risk assessment isn't used, if a risk assessment isn't communicated, if it isn't something that can be used, then it's no good. So I don't want to talk about these thick documents which are there to protect the business. What I want to do is protect the user, and therefore that would protect the business. Because let's be honest, if we can reduce any risk, then therefore there is no issues to the business going forward. And that's the way I like to look at it. Not necessarily a case of a tick box document that you need. It's about doing something which is actually useful and really used on a day-to-day basis. So what I'm going to go through really is, as I say, an echo and just expanding on the points that has been mentioned by Adam. So I'm going to look at social distancing. What is it? What does it actually mean? Because that's extremely important, because understanding what we need to do understands how we can put that into place. I'm then going to look basically at who we need to protect, and why do we need to protect that, and then go into that risk assessment. The final bit here is talking about some of the specific measures that have been advised for your industry about going back to work. Now, one of the things I'm going to say here is there's lots of crossovers in industries. Most industries, whether you're in construction, you will have back office staff and things like that. So I will briefly talk about some of those sections, but I do also want to talk about the on the ground sections as well. So I'm going to go through those. I'm going to talk mainly about things like access and egress, break rooms, washrooms, use of vehicles, and actually using vehicles from a day-to-day basis, a bit about construction, and then things like meetings and contractor visits. I will talk about cleaning and sanitisation, because it is extremely important. And like Adam said, the most important thing we can do here is wash our hands. So I must obviously talk about that in a general format as well. And PPE and face coverings, very briefly, because I think Adam's covered that fairly well, and certainly covered a lot of the very detail on that one. And then finally, I'm going to talk about existing risk assessments, because one of the things I implore everybody to do here is you need to review what you've already got in place, because some of the things that you may be putting in place may or will impact your existing risk assessments and change those going forward, and you may need to review those as well. So starting off, what is social distancing? Well, currently social distancing is basically keeping a physical barrier, and that's all social distancing means. It's keeping a barrier, a distance between people, so that the spread of COVID is reduced. Like has been mentioned, and Adam said, they are looking at reviewing this, and it has been, and on the BBC I was reading this morning that it has been said that they will review this within weeks. What does that mean for you? Well, at the moment, absolutely nothing, because they will look at reviewing it. They haven't said there's going to be any change. They're just saying they will look at reviewing it. Currently, it's 2 meters or 6'6", 6.5 feet. So what does that actually look like? Well, it's about the width of 2 vehicles. That's roughly, or vehicle and a half, that's the sort of width we're looking at here. So you can start to place things into context about what actually it is. Yorkshire actually had one of the best ones. I think it was about 4 sheep, they reckoned. So have a look at some of that. But you're looking at 2 meters, 6'6". Going forward, that may well change, but your risk assessments will have to look at whether you make that change, because whatever the advice is, it is advice. It's not saying you have to implement it. It is always advice, and you need to look at ways in what your risk assessment says. One of the things here, you might find that for one reason or another, and whether that's what people's perception is, or whether that's because of your site and what you can do, you may decide, even if they change it to 1 meter, that you continue with the 2 meter rule. One of the things, like Adam said, think about your signage, think about what you're saying, and I think that's quite important with things going forward, that if you've got any signage, you need to make a note of what it actually says and whether there's any changes going forward and whether you need to change that. But realistically, I think at the moment it's a fairly good thing to say 2 meters is standard. Okay, so it works by basically preventing the spread by the simple thing that most infection is covered by people breathing out droplets in their normal natural breath, and that transferring and being breathed in by somebody else. The further you are apart, the less likely that is to happen. So although we've said 2 meters, if we can make it longer, if we can make it wider, if we can get further away from somebody, then therefore that will reduce it down. So whatever you're doing when you're looking at your risk assessments, you need to make that as big a gap as possible. And if that exceeds the 2 meters, and you can do that, so you can do that in a safe and workable manner, then that's always better. That's always better. Basically, we're just looking at slowing down this spread of COVID-19, reducing the numbers, keeping that R number, so that's the rate of infection, down as low as possible. With that R number below 1, then it's less than 1 person you're infected, and the numbers of people being infected are coming down, and gradually, hopefully, it should start to eliminate. The other thing with social distancing here we need to think about is the reassurance that it's safe. Reassuring people that it's safe to shop, work, spend, come into work and operate. And that is important, if not more important than any of the advice about what you need to do. You need to make sure people feel safe. You need to make sure your workers feel safe. And the fact that the government say 2 meters is as much a case of you need to adhere to that as a minimum, because if you don't, people don't feel safe. And when we start looking at who you need to protect and why they need to be protected, the guidance is nobody should attend a workplace that is unsafe. And most of the time, what we're talking about here is not necessarily it being unsafe, but somebody feeling it's unsafe. And that's the conversation you'll end up having. Most of this is down to communication. You might do the best risk assessment ever. You might put all the things in place to make sure it is safe. But if the person doesn't feel safe, then they don't really need to attend work. There is a bit of a HR thing here, and I'll leave that to the HR experts in terms of at what point at what point is somebody refusing to come into work because it's unreasonable or it's reasonable. But my view personally is, if they say they feel unsafe, if they say it's not safe, and you've put everything, and you say you've put everything in place, 90% of the time, it's down to that communication, and that's something you really need to think about and need to look at if you're hitting that problem, especially if you're hitting that problem with more than one individual. So who are we protecting? Well, realistically, COVID-19 hasn't changed our responsibilities. There is no change to health and safety rules. That hasn't changed at all. So under Section 2 of the Health and Safety at Work Act, general duties of employees to their employees. Get it right. I've got my teeth in this morning. Is you need to protect your employee to ensure what is reasonably practical, the health and safety of work of all employees. Okay, so what that basically means is you as an employer need to keep your employees safe. Straightforward as that. They also have their duty under the Health and Safety at Work Act to comply with that and need to comply with what you put in place. So that's basically follow the risk assessments. So your job is to tell them what to do. Their job is to follow what to do. And it's as straightforward as that. No change at all. So like we've said previously, we're going to do a risk assessment at this point. Your risk assessment is no different to what you did before. And I think a lot of people, certainly in construction and in that industry, are fairly confident with what a risk assessment is because there is no change. So it is a case of just doing one for that specific risk that has now presented itself. It's just a new risk. So it's no different to introducing a new tool or new equipment or a new working practice. You've got to do a risk assessment for one of those, exactly the same as you've got to do a risk assessment for COVID-19. So what do we need to do? And I've put together a few very, very simple steps that we need to think about sort of going forward, and we need to look at in terms of the risk assessments and what we need to do. The very first one we need to make very, very clear is ask staff not to attend work if you're showing any symptoms of any illness. So if there is any illness which may well be COVID related, you need to ask staff not to attend work. This may mean you need to look at your sickness and sort of holiday and things like that entitlement and how the reporting process takes place. It is extremely important that it's nice and easy for people to report the symptoms, report their illness. So you need to look at that going forward. That is something that even if there is no change to it as well, you need to communicate it to the staff. Communication is key here. There have been a lot of changes to, I'm going to say, the government's response to sort of sickness. There has been a lot of changes to some of the big business in terms of their sickness and welfare policies. So you must communicate what yours are to your employees. One of the things I think, or I have seen sort of coming up, is people seeing changes that maybe some big business has made to their sickness policies and thinking that is a new law that's come in when it's not necessarily, and there may not be changes to yours going forward. So whatever you're doing, whether you're not changing it or changing it, make sure you communicate that to your workforce. As I say, make it easy for reporting any issues, sickness, or improvements that need to be made. So the reporting process needs to be looked at. Again, I'm hoping that most of you will have that in place fairly well, but do make sure it's nice and easy for people and they know what to do. Making sure people know what to do is the key thing to making it actually happen. So we're talking about clear written communication around policies and procedures, and also communication verbally as well. Show that it's been communicated. You might do this on several means. You might send emails out. That's really good, but let's be honest, not everybody reads all that small print of those emails. So I would also do your toolbox talks and stuff like that. And we'll talk a bit more about how to do that going forward, especially as we're reducing down interaction, because there's a little bit of a conundrum there of reducing down meetings, yes, but we need to have more to show what we're doing. But also look at things like your social media. And I think that's really important. Show what you're doing, because that shows it to the wider community as well as your employees. Remind staff, drill it into them. And I always use the red light system here. And when I say the red light system, what I mean is we all know to stop at a red light. The reason we know to stop at a red light is because since a young age, it's been drilled into us. Day in, day out, that red light means stop. The more you drill it into somebody, the more likely they are to just do it naturally. So keep reminding people. Now, this might be in briefings, it might be in those toolbox talks, but it's probably going to be in signage. So you need to drill what measures you have in place going forward, time and time again. Make it clear, make it consistent, and enforce anything which you are putting in place. So if somebody breaks the rules, you need to enforce it. No different to if you're on a construction site and somebody walks on with no boots, they're not allowed on, they're taken off. They're taken off, it's enforced, it's nice and clear, everybody knows the rules in exactly the same way. Any COVID restrictions that you put in place through your risk assessment, you need to enforce in a clear, consistent manner. The other thing is to make sure people have access to PPE and welfare facilities when required. And the welfare facilities is probably the most important one here. I will talk about what you need to do to your welfare facilities to help protect sort of cross-contamination and spread, but we do need to make sure people have access to that. So things like washing your hands. From day one of this, washing your hands has been the key message that's been put out. So you need to continue that going forward, and that's the way we're going to actually stop the majority of the spread. It's not to do with some of the other bits of PPE and stuff like that. That does have its place, but just a simple washing your hands is the most important thing that we can do. So having access to those welfare facilities is important. I'm going to mention RIDDOR here. So for those of you who are not familiar with RIDDOR, it's the reporting of injuries, diseases, and dangerous occurrences. Basically, to put it very blunt and simple, it is a case of if somebody has an incident at work, which is under RIDDOR of the injuries, diseases, dangerous occurrence, you need to report it to the HSE or your enforcing body. Now, when we're talking about enforcing bodies, for the majority of you today, I would expect that to be the HSE. So HSE enforce for any high risk industries, so construction being one, factories, things like that, where there's a high risk, and the local councils enforce, I'm going to say the low risk, things like retail, stuff like that. But under RIDDOR, if there is an incident, you need to report it. COVID-19 is a reportable incident. So if there is reasonable evidence that there was a exposure at work, it must be reported. You must report it to HSE or the body. I'm hoping nobody ever gets onto this one. A worker dies as a result of it through occupational exposure. And realistically, most of that would be through things like healthcare and stuff like that, which not the industries we're talking about. But we're talking about things here where you might go to somebody's house because you're delivering or you're doing work at somebody's house, and then suddenly you find that they've been infected by COVID. That, in my mind, would be a reportable incident. It's not intentional. You didn't know it when it came about, but you've been exposed. And it's not to say that there's a problem here. And this is the thing that people get scared about RIDDOR, about I'm reporting something to say I've made a mistake. No, not necessarily. You're reporting something so it can be tracked. We hear about the track and trace and identifying sort of those clusters. That's part of what this is, and that goes through any of the health and safety side of things. It's not a case of always saying, I've made a mistake here. What we're saying is, this has happened. We know it's happened, so we're reporting it so that something can be done about it. And in this instance, clearly it is about something being done about it. The other one I'm going to mention here is customers. Now, for some of you, you'll be customer facing. For some of you, you may not. But you do have a duty in the same way as protecting your employees is to protect your customers. And the key thing here is this second bullet point here. Customers need to feel safe when shopping. Otherwise, they'll just go elsewhere. A lot of people say that when you work for yourself, you don't have a boss. No, you do have a boss. The difference is your boss is your customers. And if they don't like it, they just don't go to you. They go somewhere else. And we've got to think about the new normal here. We've got to think about what people's perception are. I, for example, need some new paint for the shed. I haven't been out to get it because I've looked at things like the queues. I've looked at how my local garden centre is dealing with things and going, I just don't want to go there. I'll go somewhere else. So you need to think about this one. And a lot of the time you will be going above and beyond what I'm going to say regulations or what advice has been published to make people feel safe. So we spoke about that from your employees' point of view, but it's as important, if not more important, from your customers' point of view, especially when we're talking about delivery drivers and things like that. You need to think about who you're seeing. If your people are ordering online, there's 2 or 3 reasons why they were ordering online. One is convenience, so you need to keep that in place. But one of the reasons might be they don't feel safe going out at the moment. If they don't feel safe going out at the moment, they're probably not going to feel safe with somebody delivering it in the same manner. They feel safer, but not fully safe. So if you can make it so that they feel safe, you're getting that edge over your competitors. So customers are something you always need to think about. So let's talk about risk assessments, and let's go through risk assessments. Like I said at the start, I want to talk about risk assessments from the very straightforward view of they need to be used. A risk assessment should not be filed away. Don't ever really, I'm going to say, don't file a risk assessment away. It should be used. It should be a grubby document that gets thumbed through and people actually read. Okay, so it needs to be clear. It needs to be concise. A lot of people ask me, how long should a risk assessment be? Well, it depends on the risk. First of all, let's say it depends on the risk. Secondly, think about the user, and you need to think about the user for that risk assessment. I would have a slightly different designed risk assessment for an office environment than a construction environment. The reason is the people in the office environment are more likely to read a longer, lengthier document than necessarily in the construction environment. That's simply because if you're out and about, you've got a piece of paper in front of you, it's blowing a wind and a gale, having 20 pages to read is just not practical. So make sure your risk assessments are fit for purpose, are fit for the people who are going to be reading it. So there is no set length to a risk assessment. It needs to cover all the main aspects. But for most things, you can cover that in a fairly short and concise document. If you can't, I suggest splitting it up. So a lot of people say, well, my COVID risk assessment is about one hazard. It's about one thing, and it comes out by the time I take it into this part of the site, that part of the site, this part, this job, it becomes a fairly lengthy document. So it's not going to be read, it's too lengthy. Well, if that's the case, split it up. So you might have a risk assessment for people coming onto site. You might have a risk assessment for deliveries for COVID, and etc., etc. So each one is fairly short and concise. The shorter and conciser it is, the more likely it is to be read. So keep it short, keep it concise, split it up if necessary, and you might have somebody who needs to read 3 or 4 of them, but they're more likely to read 3 or 4 short documents than one long document. I always look about it in the same way as reading books for my son at night. I'll read him a book each night, which takes me 5 minutes, and I read him a different book each night. But I won't sit down and gradually read a novel through it because it's just like, oh, that's a long document. So think about it in that one, set it out in those short, concise documents if you need to. The other thing I want to mention here is a lot of the people who are selling risk assessments for COVID, and there are lots of people selling risk assessments for COVID. You don't need them. That's a straightforward first thing. You do not need them. And I think there will be a crackdown on these going forward, because if they're not coming out of site, if they're not looking at your business individually, then how are they going to be able to give the risk assessment. And in the same way, they don't know your business. You are in the best position to know your business, to know your staff, to know what they'll do, to know what they'll put in place themselves, to know how you can still operate in a manner that is still commercially viable and still be COVID secure. You are the person who actually has that knowledge, not somebody you're purchasing in. There are some good sample risk assessments out there, and Arco have put one on their website. I've had a look at that. I think it's a really good risk assessment, to be honest. It's nice, it's concise. There are bits in there which may not be relevant to you, so just have a look at that. But the key thing is, if you want a template, you can get them for free, but you don't necessarily need to use a template. And I'm going to go through how I would go about doing a, I'm going to say, non-templated risk assessment and what you need to do going forward. So the very first thing we do is identify the hazard. We look at what that hazard is and what it actually means. So we've kind of started to do that already when we've started to go through today's session. We've looked at social distancing, and we've identified that COVID-19 is the main hazard that we're going to be talking about. There may well be other hazards, and there may well be other parts to it. So we may be talking about COVID-19 on deliveries, or COVID-19 on building sites, or something like that. So we may have parts to that one, but COVID-19 is the main hazard and the transfer of that. We've spoken about how it gets transferred. The main way it gets transferred is droplets in the air from people breathing in and out on a normal, everyday breath. You breathe out millions of little droplets, and those are the main way that people will get infected with COVID. The second way, as Adam spoke, is this new word of fomites, which basically means touching things. You know, it's when we say fomites is the item you touch, and touching things is another way that it gets transferred. So we all know the basic hazard we're looking for. So we can go around our workplace, we can go around, take a clipboard, and we can say, this is what we need to do. So first things first, get your clipboard out, get your sheet of paper out, and walk around as if you're an employee or a customer or whoever. Walk around and have a look at what these hazards are. So let's take a fairly straightforward one of turning up to work, turning up at your depot to go and pick your van up. So the very first hazard that we might come across is opening the front door. Yeah, that is a touch point. You've got to open the door, you're touching the handle, there is a touch point there. That's the hazard. The next one we might go to is signing in. We pick up a pen, we sign our name in, or we swipe through a swipe card or something like that, depending on what your process is. As I say, you're in the best position to know your process. We go through each of those hazards separately and we make a list of them. It's straightforward as that. Make that list of, say, that's a possibility, that's a possibility. The next thing we'll look at is who is at risk. Who might come into contact with this one? And this is extremely important. The reason this is extremely important is because when we're looking at risk assessments, we're looking at removing hazards. If we can remove a hazard completely, then there is no need to put anything in place in terms of PPE or control measures. The one I'm going to mention here is people working from home, and I'm going to talk about office staff very quickly. If you've got office staff, and a lot of people, and especially lots, sites and things like that, will have people who still can work from home. And the advice at this point is, if they can still work from home, they still should work from home. And that reduces the risk. It reduces the risk not only to them who are working from home, but also other people, because you've got less people on site. So do you need your accountant, your bookkeeper, to come into site every day? Can things be done remotely? Can your office staff, can that section of the business still work from home? It may well give you a saving here, because it may mean you need less office space. So there may be a benefit here as well. But what we're trying to do is remove the risk totally. So if your office staff don't have to come in, the people at risk are no longer the office staff. It's only the essential workers that have to come in. So identify those people who are at risk. We can look at ways we can sort of manage that going forward. The next thing we need to do is evaluate the risk. Now, I like to do that on a double scale of 1 to 10. Double scale of 1 to 10. So I basically put 2 numbers down. I evaluate what the potential risk is. So what is the likelihood of that risk actually taking place? So let's say opening a door. What is the potential that somebody may get infected from opening that door? Well, if you've got a nice big touch handle where you've got to push the handle down, you need good contact, I'm going to say that the chances of actually touching it are very, very high, because otherwise you can't get in. And the chances of it being infected are also, I'm going to say, reasonably high with no precaution measures in place. So I'm going to say no cleaning, no nothing like that. The chances are that it's going to be fairly high. So on a scale of 1 to 10, where 0 is no risk at all, that's the perfect one. 10 being it's definitely going to happen, no matter what is going to happen. I would say it's probably around about the 6 to 8 mark. Probably I'd plump for about 7 here on a nice big door you've got to open. That's quite high. The next one is, what is the risk of that infection sort of taking place in this instance? So the first one is, what's the risk of somebody touching it and there being an infection on there? Second one is, what is the risk of it taking place and what's the result of that? Well, that depends on your workforce a lot. It depends on a lot of different things, but I'm going to say the chances of somebody contracting it, if there's no other measures in place, if there's something on that one, and the danger to somebody, we know it's a fairly life-threatening condition. I'm also going to put that around about the 6 level. Again, reasonably high. This gives you a good idea of what you need to do, because what we're trying to do is try and get those numbers as low as we possibly can. And that's what a risk assessment is. It's about bringing those numbers down to that 0 if possible. The idea being 0. Chances are we're not going to get it down to 0, but there are ways we can look at it. The reason I use the door to start off with is because there are some things that we can put in place. The first one is straightforward. Let's change the door to an automatic door. So what, in that case, how have we changed that risk? What is the chance of somebody touching that and getting COVID-19 on them if it's an automatic door? I'm going to say 1, because the chances are some people touch doors, automatic doors, certainly, yeah, but the chances are very, very low. So we brought that number down to 1. That is good. However, that's quite expensive. So what else could we do? Why don't we just leave the door open? Could we prop that door open? Again, this is where we need to look at other risk assessments, such as your fire risk assessment, because it might have an impact on that. Equally, things like cleaning of the door handles. That cleaning regime will bring those numbers down. And the lower we can get those numbers down, the better. It's all about getting those numbers down. The very last thing we ever put into place are control measures in terms of PPE, barriers, things like that. It's always about putting things in place that we can actually do, which don't impact on the day-to-day running of the business. Don't cost additions. They're just stupid things, I'm going to say, like propping doors open, like opening windows. If that reduces the risk down, just that 1 point or half a point, then that's a benefit that we're making without impacting the day-to-day business. Some of these will be existing and some of them will be additional, because you'll identify things like additional cleaning and you will need to put that into place. Recording of risk assessments and findings. We need to record what we do. It's important that we record what we do. One of the things, and I'm going to say a bit of a myth here, is that you don't need to do a risk assessment if you have less than 5 employees. That is a complete myth. You still need to do a risk assessment. The difference is, under 5 employees, you do not have to have it written down. But I'm going to say you need to, because it comes back to several things. The first of all, if something went wrong, and this is what a lot of people look at, if something went wrong, how do you prove you've done it if you haven't written it down? More importantly, is how do you communicate it? How do people feel safe? And communication is the key. So I'm going to say, ignore that one. If you've got less than 5 employees, still have your risk assessments written down. It is important to have them written down. Yes, the rule is saying you don't have to have them written down, but you still need to do a risk assessment at the very minimum. And if you think about it, if you're a one-man band, you still do your risk assessment, because, you know, I get up in the morning, I do a risk assessment, I go downstairs, I have my cup of tea, and I put it on the table and not on the edge of the table. That's doing a risk assessment of, I don't want it on the edge of the table because I might knock it off. That's all we're doing. So do make sure you record it, whatever you do. And although I said it shouldn't be filed away, a copy should be filed away, I will say, but your main copy needs to be distributed to people. So look at how you're going to do that. Think about ways you might do that. You might have a file with those risk assessments in the van. You might communicate it via email, via social media, on your website. And one of the things that is said is, if you've got over 50 employees, they suggest that your risk assessments should be put on your website. I'm going to bring that down and say that everybody in the same way should communicate this and put it on your website as a nice and easy way to show your staff, your customers, and everybody exactly what you're doing, and that you've gone and done this risk assessment and get the benefit for the time you've spent doing it. You're turning up today, you're listening to this about how to do it, you're going to spend time doing it, get the benefit for it. Get the kudos. So I would say put it on your website. It looks good. It looks good if nothing else. And you need to monitor and review it. Like was said about things like social distancing being reduced down to 1 meter. I think that's likely to happen going forward. In fact, I'm going to say it's almost definitely going to happen at some point. We don't know when. So do keep reviewing it. You may decide that you're going to keep the 2 meter going forward, even if that's changed because, as I said, for one reason or another, because your risk assessment says so. Yeah, or your marketing says so. One of those will say, I'm going to keep 2 meters. So you might keep it, but you need to monitor and review it. Things are changing daily. People's perception are changing daily. And we are in this new normal. So monitor, review it as regularly as you can. It's not a document that ever should have any dust on it. It's one of the most used documents in any business. So talking about some measures that you can take place, and I'm just going to start off with a few pictures just to kind of break up the presentation a little bit here. Now, some of them seem a bit silly. We've got the lift on the left-hand side there. I've got to say, I'm not looking forward to using a lift on that one. But equally, we've got things like the queuing systems on the right there. And we need to think about some of these. And I think the one on the right does show the point I'm trying to make with this one is we are going to be looking at reduced capacities and things like that. When we're looking at customers, and I don't know if anybody's seen the shops. Did anybody see things like TK Maxx open yesterday? The queues were massive. They're down my local high street. They were down the high street. But then you start thinking about it and think that's only about 20 people, because if everybody's 2 meters apart, so it looks a lot worse than it is. And I'm sure every one of you have driven past the local post office or something like that and gone, I wouldn't queue there, and then think actually there's only about 10 people. Again, it's perception, and whether that's from a customer's point of view, but also from an employee's point of view, it's something you're going to need to think about, and every industry is going to be affected by that one. You're going to need to think about things like your deliveries, because you don't want loads of deliveries, loads of vans, loads of lorries queuing up trying to get into site because of a slow process, because of a queuing system. Equally, things like break rooms and stuff like that, you don't want these big queues. They take up space, for one. They don't look good. They reduce efficiency. So look at ways that you can actually increase efficiency going forward. Equally, I'm going to say think outside the box. Now, again, in some ways not so relevant, because these are a couple of examples from restaurants. I think one was in Singapore and one's in Germany. The one with the pool noodles is in Germany, I believe. But I like them. I thought they were a bit funny, so I'll put them in. The one on the left is basically to reduce numbers in a restaurant. Instead of making it look really sparse, instead of putting big screens up and don't go here and don't do that, all they did is they put a panda on every other seat. That meant somebody can't sit there, but it's still quite fun. It doesn't detract from the everyday sort of experience of visiting that restaurant in the same way that sitting with massive gaps in between and missing chairs would do. The one on the right I just thought was funny. It's a great way of showing sort of thinking outside the box, but do think outside the box. Think about things that also might enforce what you're going to do in a way that people will remember. I can almost guarantee you'll remember that picture of those pool noodles going forward. So the reason I put it in is for that, to make you think, to make you remember. Try and get that into your industry as well. So few things that we need to consider. So I'm going to say here that the government have produced some guidance on this. And that's what I'm going to go through in the next section here, is the government guidance of what they've actually said. So there are 2 or 3 documents to have a look at here. And it depends on your business to which ones are the most relevant. But they produced 7 guides to say for each industry about things you need to do. Now, on the .gov.uk website, there is a link at the end of today's session for them, and I'm going to suggest that everybody has a read of them. In terms of what they've produced, they're not the worst government documents in the world. They are actually half readable, so they are something that you can read. But they do have some interesting little tick boxes, some interesting little sort of, I'm going to say, semi-posters that you can go through, and it's worth having a look at that. A lot of the information isn't so specific as saying you must do this and you must do that, but it is guidance. So very first thing you need to do, go on the .gov.uk website and have a look at that guidance. .gov.uk website is, I'm going to say, the Bible at this point. There are lots of people putting out guidance, and I've read some on various websites that are, I'm not going to say not correct. Not correct is not the right word, but are interpretations of the guidance, and you need to make your own interpretations. So I'm going to go through some of those, and I've read each one of these, and I'm going to go through what the main points for each individual and each industry is. And so some key points, first of all, that go through all of these. You need to consider all aspects of the workplace. So this also includes things like your car parks, your break rooms, your entrances, and also how people get to and from work. That is something that you need to think about, how people get to and from work and areas in and around this, so things like car parks, smoking shelters, that sort of thing. As I've already said, any employees that show symptoms of COVID-19, no matter how small, should not attend work. The next point is you cannot discriminate against anyone. That is, again, no difference to what's before. And certainly we've seen a lot about protests and things like that at the moment in terms of race and stuff like that. We're not necessarily talking about race here. We are to a point, but we're also talking about other things like pregnancy. People who are having to shield, people with underlying health conditions. In the same way, you couldn't discriminate against them before, you can't discriminate against them now. but in the same way that you needed to take certain things into account, so let's take pregnancy being one, that you needed to take into account the impact that that might have on your employee and what jobs that they can and can't do, you still need to do the same with COVID-19 and how that is affected. But you cannot discriminate. You cannot discriminate. That hasn't changed. And I think now it's as important and in the media as much as anything else. So make sure that's sort of high up on your priorities. If social distancing cannot be maintained, you need to think about whether that activity actually needs to take place. And some activities may not be necessary for the business. So what we're not saying here that if social distancing cannot take place, that you can't go, you can't work. What we're saying is, does that actual aspect need to take place? What I'm going to put on here is meetings. I have a regular team meeting each week with the rest of Blue Orchid. Does that need to take place on a face-to-face basis? No, not necessarily. We have Zoom now. Yeah, this is the new normal. Again, we don't need that activity to take place. We can find a different way around it. We can have a look at things we need to do. So starting off with access and egress. So entrance and exit, posh words for entrance and exit. Okay, we'll start off away from work. And like I said, you need to consider about people getting to work, how they get to work. There are restrictions as of yesterday, wasn't it, that you have to wear face masks on public transport. And I've got to say, I'm not looking forward to that at all myself. Realistically, I do not like the idea of wearing face masks. I don't know if anybody here wears them fairly regularly, but they are uncomfortable. They're not great in terms of comfort levels, and also if you've got people with breathing issues, breathing difficulties, they also are not great. And that's one of the reasons why people with breathing difficulties have been excluded from having to wear them on public transport. And so that came into force yesterday. Think about how people get to work, because that will have an impact on your staff to start off with. If nothing else, if I had to catch the bus to work and I got there and I didn't enjoy the journey, I'd be grumpy when I got to work, which is going to affect my work. So if nothing else, it's going to affect your work. So let's look at things we can do. Encourage people to walk or cycle to work. Encourage people to come in different ways. That will hopefully have a positive benefit on your workforce, as well as anything else. So you might want to be putting in things like bike racks, looking at things like the cycle to work schemes. These are easy things which make you look like a good employer, improve your workforce's safety going forward, and hopefully also improve their mood as well. Encourage people to walk or cycle to work. Try and remove touch points from entrances. Again, something fairly straightforward, hopefully, to do. If you've got swipe in and swipe out systems, maybe look at changing that so you show somebody the ID card. Get rid of the pen you have to sign in on, and change that sort of system. Maybe have somebody do a tick, sort of register, a bit like your school. Automatic doors, or just propping those doors open, so the first person opens the door and that stays open for the rest of the day, so that everybody else doesn't have to open and close the door, reducing down those touch points, reducing down the points of contact. Encourage hand washing and sanitization on entrance and exit of the building. You might need to put hand wash stations in place. Even better would be full hand wash stations rather than the alcohol ones. I think the alcohol ones should be, I'm going to say, a last resort, but realistically probably the most practical for most people. So put those in at the entrance and exits of the buildings, and that stops people from transferring the disease when they're touching things. And if they do touch something and they get it on their hands, they're then sanitized straight after. So those points at entrances and exits, I think, are something you need to do. Again, so that people can see it. It's nice and visual, but also it's a high touch point area. Look at staggering your shifts, so reducing the contact that way. If everybody arrives at the same time, it's very difficult to keep that social distancing, but just staggering those shifts by 5 or 10 minutes means that people arrive at different times and you haven't got the interaction there. You haven't got those pinch points of those doors where everybody's trying to get through at the same time. Again, think about when you were at school and the bell went off, everybody tried to get through that door at the same time. That's a contact point. Reducing that down means you won't have that issue. Try and come up with one-way systems where you've got an entrance and exit point. Again, that means you don't have people clashing. A lot of buildings won't be possible to do this, I know, but you know, certainly for a lot of depots where you've got larger areas, hopefully it should be fairly straightforward. The other thing is, do people need to come into the office? Do they need to come into that building? So we might need to look at restricting access to certain people. So let's take a delivery driver coming in to pick up his stuff. Does he actually need to go into the office to pick up his roster for what he's doing? Or can that be put outside so he's not even having to access the building? Again, this may increase your efficiency. It may save that driver 5-10 minutes because that job is being passed to someone else. And not only does it reduce the risk, but it saves you 5 or 10 minutes. And he's on the road 5 or 10 minutes earlier, which can make all the difference on what sort of work gets done in that day. I've put there, use tape to reinforce social distancing. And what I'm talking about here, again, is signs, but an easy way of doing this. And again, if we're looking at whether this changes to the 1 meter rule, it's an easy way to actually add this in and change that if that does change, is just put some tape on the floor to show what 2 meters actually is. It's very difficult to imagine what 2 meters is, and everybody has a slightly different idea of what that is. But a bit like, I'm sure you've all driven down the motorway and you've seen the chevrons and it says you should keep this far apart. Well, this tape will help you keep that far apart, because I'm sure when you've driven down that motorway and gone, I should be this far apart, you've kind of pulled back a little bit and gone, oh, is it really this far? Yeah, hang on, I'm a bit too close at the moment. It's helped you keep that sort of distance. Do it in the same sort of way. Do it in the same way. Sorry, I'm not sure what's just happened there. Right, we'll hopefully be back again in a second. Apologies here, I seem to be having some technical issues with the screen sharing. I don't know what's happening here. Right, apologies. I don't know what's happened with the screen sharing at the moment. I'm going to continue because we've got a fair bit to go through. What I will say at this point is copies of the slides and the recording of today will be available at the end. So as I said, apologies about the issues we seem to be having. I will keep trying to sort out exactly what that is as we carry on. So moving on, I'm going to talk about break rooms and canteens, especially when we're talking about sort of construction sites and stuff like that. So I'm going to say here, we need to look at your occupancy levels. So it is a case of you can still have those break rooms. Those break rooms are still able to be used. There is no change there. but we need to look at whether it can be used to the same extent. So you may need to put in social distancing tape barriers in. You may need to look at how many people can use it. You may need to increase areas that you can have breaks and canteens, and exactly what people are able to use on those. So we may again need to look at staggering the times of our breaks. That will help reduce down those numbers, will help keep the numbers in those break rooms as low as possible. And again, only staggering by 5 or 10 minutes will have the ability to help reduce those numbers down and mean you don't have to put additional things in place. Have a look at encouraging breaks outside. So this might be areas which are set aside, areas which are open for people to sit and have breaks. I know certainly on a lot of construction sites, there's lots of areas that you can have which you could sign off, you could fence off to say, this is an area you sit and have a break. Put up a couple of gazebos, that sort of thing, so that if the weather's not so good, it's still an area that people can use. It's much better than people sitting in their vehicles. It's much nicer for the employees, for the workers as well, but it is also much better in terms of the health and well-being, because that airflow that comes through in the same way will reduce down the sort of spread of COVID. In the same way, if you think about smoke, if you're outside, that soon dissipates out the way, and you don't have that sort of transfer. In the same way, COVID works the same way. So have those areas, encourage that outside best you can. Avoid opening the canteens if you've got them by having things like packed lunches and packed meals. Again, try and encourage people to stay on site. So they do still want you to stay on site, because if you stay on site, you're not going to transfer anything in from outside. So this might be a case of have a look at your local sandwich van. Try and get your sandwich van to come to you, rather than everybody going off to get that bacon butty on a Friday. Arrange for somebody to come to you. That won't just have the effect of reducing down the risk, but it will probably also increase your employees, I'm going to say support of you, but increase that you look as a good employer as well. You're going to have to look at cleaning between breaks, and one of the things I'm going to say here is encourage that self-cleaning. Put things in place so that people can self-clean. So make sure you have, I say, hand sanitization, I've spoken about many times, but also make sure that you have things like spray and wipes for people to clean down surfaces, clean down the kettle between use, and encourage people to do that one. A bit like in the same way you go into a toilet and it says, please wash your hands. Yeah, how many times does that remind people to do things? And I'm sure there's a lot of people who wouldn't do it if they didn't see the sign. So put up a sign saying, please wipe down the kettle before and after use, and have some Dettol wipes or something like that. Simple things like that will help reduce down the spread and help reduce down those numbers that I spoke about when we're talking about risk assessments down to that low level. Reduce the use of shared items, so encourage people to have their own items, and this kind of comes into a lot of things from cups, but also when we start talking about other things like stationery, keep items specific to the individual, so reduce the use of shared items going forward. As I say, I'm sorry, we still seem to be having issues with the screen share, so apologies on that one. Showers and washrooms, and I think washrooms is going to be the key one here, but showers also come into the same thing. If it's communal, obviously you need to speak to your landlord, but you are going to have to increase the cleaning of these, and they do still want to be in place, especially washrooms, because people need to wash their hands. Washing hands, as we said, is one of the most important parts of it, so make sure that those are available. We might need to look at limiting access to these. So you might have your staff for one area go into one washroom, another area go into another washroom, and that reduces that cross-contamination. If we can keep these bubbles, as people refer to them now, which are little groups of people, then it can only ever be transmitted in that group, and it doesn't move to another group. So we might have a separate one for people visiting, a separate washroom there for people to go and use, a separate washroom for staff on X floor, a separate washroom for people who are on site, etc., etc. And if we can keep that access to that team, it makes management nice and easy, because we can see who goes in, who doesn't clean, who does. But as I say, it reduces that cross-contamination. Provide sanitization stations and allow people to self-clean. Keep it self-cleaning. So that is an easy way of increasing the cleaning without actually increasing too much of the cost. Is getting people to wipe surfaces down in between use. So the same way as kitchens, canteens and things like that, washrooms, shower rooms are the same. Keep all areas clear of personal items. So introduce that sort of clear, I say clear desk, because as it tends to be referred to, but in most situations it's not a desk, but keep clear of personal items, especially when we're talking about showers and washrooms. Those are often harder to clean, and it makes things nice and tidy going forward and makes it easier to clean and less contamination. So keep areas clear of personal items. So the key thing here is washrooms you still need to have access to in the same way. You'll need to increase the cleaning, and you'll need to look at when they get cleaned. I would say here, I'd introduce on all areas, whether that be a washroom, whether it be a kitchen, whether it be a canteen, a break room, anything like that. One of the systems which really works well is what we see in a lot of pubs and things like that, where you go to the toilet there and you'll see this was last inspected and last cleaned on such a time. Here's a signature. It's a very visual way to increase that confidence and to show what you're doing, and also to record what you're doing. So you're recording what you're doing, which is what we need to do to show that we are compliant, but more importantly, it communicates it to people. People go, yeah, that sounds good. That is good. So let's talk about vehicles and what it means by vehicles. It is very difficult to social distance in a vehicle. Yeah, we know that. That's something that's going to come across. If we can, first of all, we still need to maintain social distancing within a vehicle. So do you, first of all, need 2 people in the vehicle? That's the very first thing when you think about. So limit numbers in vehicle where possible. Where possible. Look at how we load and unload. Yeah, if we are using vehicles, does the driver need to help load or unload? Can it be done by mechanical means? So can we stick stuff on pallets and forklift it into the back or onto the back of the truck? You know, that reduces that interaction. So 2-man lifts, can that be reduced to moving with mechanical means? Have a clear policy of how unloading takes place. So one of the things here you might say is driver stays in the vehicle for deliveries, if that's possible. And that I know is implemented on a lot of sites where as a driver you turn up and the vehicle is unloaded without you even getting out of the vehicle. That reduces interaction. It reduces the spread. If you have to use 2 people, and I know a lot of deliveries may have to have 2 people, try and keep pairings fixed. Now this has several benefits. The first one is the reducing of the spread, because those fixed partnerships mean it's only ever going to get hopefully spread between the partnership. But equally, I think when you start coming into work relationships, having that partner system hopefully will increase productivity as well, because you get to know your partner. So maintaining those fixed pairings, I don't think will have a huge impact in productivity. Keep vehicles well ventilated. It's an interesting one, this one, and that's basically what the guidance says. The general thing is open windows. Again, having that airflow through reduces down the spread. So not have the recirculation in the vehicles that we're fairly used to these days. So let's go back to having the sort of arms out the window again, and opening those windows. It's good weather at the moment. Get some fresh air. It's always good for you. It certainly, you know, wakes you up in the morning, keeps you going through the day. That extra oxygen, always good. Ensure vehicles are regularly cleaned. Now, for some vehicles, you'll be swapping vehicles, drivers and stuff like that. You need to avoid that if possible. So try and establish vehicles that are specific to a person or a group of people. So you're not swapping around who goes in which vehicle here, who goes in that vehicle tomorrow, things like that. Try and keep the vehicles the same. However, you still need to increase the cleaning, and this is inside we're talking about mainly here, but outside as well, because you've got handles, touch points, windows, things like that. You are going to have those touch points, and you are probably going to need to increase the cleaning at those points as well, or will need to increase the cleaning at those points. So have regular internal cleaning as well. Have that said schedule of trying to get people into the habit of just cleaning and wiping down. Again, Dettol wipe at the end of the day is a great way of just ensuring things are kept clean. It's also going to have the added benefit of hopefully making those vehicles a nicer place to work, and cleaning is always a good maintenance of any vehicle. Physical screening is an option for vehicles, and I have seen pictures of screens in between driver and passenger for vehicles, and probably the most obvious one here will be taxis and stuff like that. We're all fairly used to those screens between driver and occupants there, but you need to make sure that it's not going to affect the safety of the vehicle. So I'm afraid this is one of the aspects where we are not going to want to knock something up with wood that we found in the back of the shed and stick a bit of a screen up in that way. That will affect safety in a vehicle. Yes, it may be suitable for a shop in terms of their till or something like that, but it is not suitable in terms of a vehicle. It needs to be something which is designed and properly maintained. And for most people, that will need to be approved in some format. So yes, it is possible. Yes, they are available, but I do think in this case, it is going to be a last resort, and also until proper bespoke things come on the market, may be cost prohibitive for most people. How we sit makes a big difference. So sitting side by side, or even better back to back, is a much better option than sitting face to face. Now, okay, most vehicles you don't tend to sit face to face, but let's look at certain things that you may have. So don't have somebody sitting directly behind you. If you can avoid having somebody sitting directly behind you, so staggering them, alternating sections, so somebody in the driver's seat and then somebody sitting in the passenger seat or the second row passenger seat is better than somebody sitting behind the driver. This really comes into minibuses or sort of work vans where you have those areas that you're sitting face to face. Avoid the face to face, and go side by side or back to back if possible. The government have actually put together a picture of a minibus with recommended places of where to sit. You can have a look at that. But if I'm being honest, I've been in lots of different minibuses and they've all had slightly different configurations. And a lot of them can also have their configurations change. So you may need to look at that going forward, especially if you're operating minibuses or coaches or anything like that on a long-term basis. This is here to stay for the foreseeable future. Schedule deliveries, schedule anything you can to avoid crowds and interaction. I will talk about deliveries in a little bit in terms of contractors, but if you can schedule things to avoid interaction, then that again reduces that contact. If there is no contact, there is no risk. Like we said before, if no contact, there is no risk. Look at what paperwork you're using. So if you can use electronic or contactless paperwork, then that's a much better way of going forward. And again, like I said before, it could increase efficiency. Most people now are fairly used to these things, you know, mobile phones and tablets. So this might be the time to implement it. And if you've got that workforce, you've always said, oh, they won't want to do that because, you know, they're not that sort of people. They may well now. People have changed. My parents who are in their late 70s are using Zoom on a regular basis. They're using WhatsApp on a regular basis. That has changed in the last 3 or 4 months. And they're going, isn't this good? I didn't realize it was this good. Your staff probably will have changed. Your customers probably will change. So using that sort of contactless side of things is a great way forward. And it, again, hopefully will increase efficiency as well as reducing down the spread. Keep personal items out of vehicles where possible. And at the end of the shift, they should be removed. This aids in the cleaning of it. So we don't have those vans with loads of bits of paperwork and stuff like that. It needs to be clean. Clear desk policy within vehicles. Provide hand sanitizer in vehicles for use between drop-offs. So anytime there is any contact between people or between surfaces, use hand sanitizer. I keep a couple of lots of hand sanitizer now in both of my cars for when I go from site to site. Hand washing is better, so we need to encourage drivers to wash their hands. Again, a policy I would personally bring in is before the shift and at the end of the shift or changing vehicles, they wash their hands thoroughly and do not, you know, not using hand sanitizer if possible, but actually wash their hands. And this goes from moving from their car to your vehicle or anything like that. Make sure drivers have access to toilets, and that's something which is hopefully easing a little bit now with shops and things like that starting to reopen. But I know for a long time, most toilets, most public toilets were closed. So you need to think about that one. And that's a welfare thing. I'm going to say that's above and beyond the COVID side of things. That is something you need to think about welfare-wise. And when we start talking about risk assessments and existing ones, it's something that's extremely important. So ensure drivers have access to toilets between breaks. So I'm just trying to get this screen to work again. So think about things like click and collect, and that reduces down the need for delivery, reduces down the need for drivers. So yeah, allow people to click and collect, reducing down interaction anyway. Sorry, I apologise about the fact that the screen sharing's gone all a bit to pot. I'm not quite sure what's happened at all. Make sure whatever you're doing, you're giving clear advice for people. So this is where the vehicles are accessing your site or you're using your vehicles to access other sites. Make sure the advice is clear, concise, easy to use, easy to operate. So when people arrive on site, they need good signage and good communication. Not the, I'm not quite sure what I should be doing. And that's the situation a lot of people are in at the moment. It's, should I do this or should I not? So make it nice and clear and give that clear advice. So you've got to regularly brief staff and visitors to the site of what measures you've put in place. And again, I try and communicate this before people arrive on site. So if you know people, you know you're getting a delivery, you know you're getting vehicles arriving on site, or you know you're going to site, ask what is in place and what you need to do. Ask for that risk assessment. Ask what does the driver need to do? Where does he need to report? Again, hopefully that will increase efficiency as well, because there won't be that waiting around and going, oh, I don't know what I'm going to do. So make sure that is communicated. And again, I'm going to go down to these, social media and things like that. Stick it on your social media channel. Or when people come on site, they need to do X, Y, and Z. Hopefully, A, that will make it more efficient for you. B, people will know what to do. And C, it's a great communication, a great marketing tool to show that I'm ahead of the game, I know what I'm doing here. Minimize contact time if possible. The less time you're in contact with somebody, the less likely to spread. So if you have got to have people have communication for unloading or loading or anything like that. Reduce that time as much as possible. Now, face coverings, we spoke about earlier, they're not required by law in vehicles, but if drivers do decide to wear masks, they should be allowed to. Definitely they should be allowed to from a personal safety point of view, because that is making somebody feel safer. Whether it makes them any safer or not is a different matter. And I think I'll leave that one up to the risk assessments. I'll leave that one up to the bods that know, but it's that feeling of being safe is as important as anything. But it's not currently not law to require drivers, etc., to wear face masks. It's something you may decide you want to implement. And like Adam said earlier on, I think if you are having that, you don't really want it to be an ad hoc item. I think you need to look at how that looks in the same way as people wear your company t-shirt and wear your uniform. If they've got some hashed up mask which they've made on the back of their old Singer sewing machine on their face, how does that look? Whereas providing them with proper, good, tidy masks of some description, depending on what your risk assessment says, will look a lot more professional, will look a lot better going forward, and will look a lot better in terms of public relations. Moving on to construction sites, and really it comes down to similar things. We spoke about a lot of this already. So stay on site. That's one of the key bits of advice here. Stay on site, so don't visit local shops, because there's the chance of that cross-infection there from people going into the shop and things like that. So try and encourage the use of pre-prepared food, whether that's bringing pre-prepared food, which is the best way, or a case of having, I say, a sandwich van come to site. So you're not encouraging that off-site moving to local shops. And again, hopefully may well have an impact on your business as well. Ways we can do that: clear break areas, areas sit down, comfy, I say comfy areas. I'm thinking of a building site with a sofa in the middle at the moment, but that's not quite what I was intending. But make sure these areas are nice for people to use. If it's nice for people to use, it's got the washing facilities, it's got the area you can sit down, people are more likely to stay on site. People are more likely to stay on site. So encourage that, set that up. Encouraging working alone if possible. That was one of the things I took from some of the government advice. They did say that. Difficult in construction because of the health and safety side of things. You're going to have to look at your risk assessment. But for certain things, you may well be able to implement this. You may be able to implement this in terms of one trade at one time. You may be able to implement this in terms of one on one floor, one on the next floor, one on one room, one in another room. So look at your processes that you need to implement. It is more difficult in construction to be working alone, but hopefully it is less difficult to implement social distancing than working fully alone. Equally, don't share tools and equipment. So try and keep the tools and equipment to that individual person. Few advantages of this one, and this I speak from experience, is how many times has that tool been broken? And somebody said he did it, and the other person says no, he did it. Well, if the tool is assigned to them, then you haven't got an argument of who actually damaged it, and people tend to look after things better. And as I say, I speak from experience in that one. But we are talking about silly little things like shovels. You know, allow the person to have their own shovel, and don't swap on things like shovels. I have even seen, and as I say, been on sites myself, people swapping hats and things like that. Don't do that. Name them, make sure people have them, so that there is no contamination there. So don't share tools and equipment. And if you do have to share tools and equipment, keep them to teams. Keep them to those pods, those as smaller number teams as possible, so that there is that lack of cross-contamination there. Again, traveling to work comes into it, trying to avoid public transport. So again, it might be a case of have an area that people can put bikes which are secure. try and encourage people other means to get to work. As I said, I personally think that will actually also increase the mood of your staff. And mental health being such an issue with people at the moment, the thought of the unknown has a huge impact on mental health. And there is definitely a correlation between exercise and fresh air and mental health. So use it to your advantage. Use it to your advantage. Vehicles we've spoken about, so limiting passengers in corporate vehicles, providing hand washing facilities, and that's something you need to look at. You might need to increase the number of hand washing facilities so that people can wash their hands regularly in between tasks, in between vehicles, in between changing tools, etc., etc. Hand sanitization stations, but most importantly, at break times. The start and the end of the day and break times, they need to wash their hands, so we make sure people do that. It is something I've seen on a lot of sites that is implemented, especially the big sites now, but the smaller sites less so. So you're going to have to implement that more so. And I can see changes going ahead. I can see changes in the future about at what point do you need to provide welfare facilities. I think the regulations of that are going to be tightened up, and you're going to have to provide welfare facilities for people on site on a smaller sites going forward than we have seen in the past. You may want to put things like hand washing facilities in the back of vans and stuff like that. We see it a lot on things like the Severn Trent vans and stuff, where they have the little sort of hand wash facilities on the back door. You may need to look upon that on your vans going forward. And it may be a case of a bottle of water and a bucket, which is for hand washing, that you provide and say each van now has this self-contained unit, no different to you get from a camping shop for people, and that's your hand washing facilities when you're going from site to site. Mentioned sort of job rotation, keep staff to single tasks. Again, hopefully then you can use the staff which are really good on each task. So try and keep them to single tasks. But one of the ones which also came up, which I thought was a brilliant idea, and again, I've seen on big sites, but less so on small sites, are the use of radios, or it's a very simple one, these things, mobile phones. Reduce that movement on site is the main thing we're looking at here. So you might say, you can't go to this area of the site, you can't go to that area of the site, so you're reducing that movement. But equally, radios will help you keep in contact. So delivery comes in, radio it through. There's not that movement about, and that again increases efficiency. You can pick up cheap radios for 10, 20 quid. It's not a big investment. And if it increases your efficiency, you don't have to save many man hours and the other safety aspects of it to actually make it worthwhile. So do consider using things like radios, phones, and stuff like that, and technology to keep in contact across site, rather than having to walk from one area to another. In the same way, in terms of deliveries, think about mechanicalization, think about pallets, think about reducing that two-person working, reducing that two-person lifts. I know that's already in place on a lot of construction sites, that mechanical means has been taken over for lifting and stuff like that, and reduced down that sort of two-person working. So that's, I think it's already in place, but you need to review that. As I say, keep those staff into bubbles in those teams. I know we spoke about it when we're looking at transferring of equipment, but equally we're looking at breaks and stuff like that. So again, you might have one or two small break areas for that team, rather than a large break area that everybody goes to, where you're having lots of interaction. Inductions and communication. Try and have these outdoors if possible. In construction sites, I think it's a lot easier because you've got the space, you've got people used to being outdoors, and usually not got the space to have them inside. So do try and hold them outdoors. It helps social distance. It makes it a lot more easier to do. Equally, I'm going to say here, and it's something to think about for some sites, for some things, consider technology. Do you have to have some of these inductions on site, some of these inductions face to face, and think about whether things like Zoom, WhatsApp, GoToMeetings can be used in some format. So maybe some of the induction can be done beforehand. That may, again, help your efficiency. It may help things going forward. And it may not suit everybody, but it is something to think about. So remote working, I think, is something you need to look at. You need to try and be ahead of the game for and see, is there a way you can bring that into your workplace? Can you get site inspections, interim inspections done via handheld device? Is that possible? As I say, if staff can work from home in construction, interesting one, but there are some staff who can work from home. So admin staff, stuff like that, they can do a lot of their work from home. Do they need to be on site on that beck and call at all points of the day, or can they work from home part of the time? The more they can, the reduction and the fact you're almost eliminating a lot of the risk totally. If they're not on site, there is no risk. Let's look at scheduling deliveries when we can, and that comes from waste facilities as well, and you probably need to increase those waste facilities and reduce touch points for waste. So again, mechanical means, and have those increased bins, stuff like that. I know on a lot of sites, again, it skips, and you stick your stuff in the skip at the end of the day, but you may have to have break rooms or break areas with rubbish bins and stuff like that. Again, keeping the site tidy. Let's keep the site tidy. And that, I think, pretty much covers most of the construction side of things. As I say, meetings wise, we need to avoid any unnecessary meetings, but we also need to probably increase communication and think about how you're going to do that one. Regular toolbox talks work. We all know that from going forward. So regular toolbox talks work. So try and introduce them, but think about whether they can be done before or after the site opens. Think about whether they can be done remotely. Think about whether they can be done outside. Think about whether they can be done in smaller teams. So you might have more of them, but in smaller teams. And do maintain social distancing in these meetings. Try and encourage hand sanitizer, washing hands before and after the meetings. So it might be part of the meeting. Make it part of the meeting. People, as they come into it, they sanitize their hands, and avoid sharing of stationery pens and pencils and things like that, or signing in on these meetings. Can we just have a person with a tick sheet saying, yes, you were there, you were there, you were there, you were there, rather than each individual person signing to say that they were there. And this, again, some of these remote tools and stuff like that actually really help that, and help that sort of management of that. I know it's difficult to implement in construction, but think about it. Think about whether it can be done. Make sure, if you are holding any meetings inside, that the rooms are well ventilated. If you can make them ventilated inside, that's really useful. Contractor visits is the next one, and we've pretty much been through this, but I just want to go through very, very quickly. Reduce contact in deliveries, reduce their access to areas. So do they actually need to be able to go to the place, or can it be dropped off? Can you have a drop-off point and then people go and collect from those? Use radios or phones for contact, so they're not having to go and ask everybody and speak to everybody and come into contact with everybody. And look at times for deliveries and cleaning before and after of these deliveries if possible. Reduce unnecessary contact at receptions and gatehouses, and try and encourage hand washing as well. Encouraging hand washing is one of the key aspects. Cleaning, we will have to look at cleaning going forward. It is something that all closed sites certainly will probably have to look at before they come back. So if your site has been closed, you will probably want to clean it beforehand because of, well, just general practice anyway. When we're talking about things like air conditioning and systems like that, you may have issues there in terms of Legionnaires, and at very least you need to run water if it's been offsite for a period of time. High-touch items need to be cleaned more regularly, and generally all sites, all depots will need to have more regular cleaning, so you need to review that and how that takes place. Different people, it's going to be different, so if your delivery sites are going to be very different, but it comes down to the same principles as vehicles. Try and clean between each use. Try and keep a clear desk policy for any area, whether that's vehicles, construction, anything like that, as clean and as tidy as possible. It helps efficiency. It helps efficiency, with cleaning. PPE, now already discussed to a point, and I said I'm more than happy to try and answer any questions here. Most people in construction and things like that will be fairly used to PPE. If you're already using PPE, you continue to use it. If you're looking at using PPE because of COVID, generally at the moment they're saying it is very much a last resort and should not be implemented unless absolutely necessary. But certainly I think Adam covered this off to a much greater standard than I probably could, being in the PPE in terms of what types of masks and things like that. Equally, I'm going to say here, if you do have staff members who want to wear PPE, if you do have staff members who come in and say, I want to wear the mask, providing it's safe to do so, you need to look at your risk assessments for other areas to see whether it's safe to do so. I would allow them to do it because it allows them to feel confident going forward. It allows them to feel that they are safe going forward. And like I said at the start, nobody has to attend an unsafe environment. And that comes down to communication. Put your risk assessments out there. Put them on your website. Stick them up on the wall. Give them to people. Share them around. Share them in a way that they can actually use it. Get them to read it. But key thing here, unlike the Apple agreement, which is however many thousands of pages long and nobody ever reads, they just tick to say, yes, I've read it and I agree with it. Make it so that people can read it. Make it so that people are wanting to read it. Personally, my risk assessments for most tasks were no more than 2 sheets of paper. And I stand by those. And the amount of times I've turned up on site and my staff are sitting there bored, read the newspaper at the first break, having their lunch and sitting there flicking through the risk assessments because what else have they got to do? They're then likely to actually follow it. Whereas if it's 200 pages long in a format that can't be read, they're not going to. So make sure it's suitable for the task. Use signage in a way that makes it convenient for people in areas that people know what they're doing. And the final one I put here is use social media. The chances are your staff are going to be looking at your business page as well. So spread the word what you're doing. Make it easy for people to know what's happening, to communicate everything out. Finally, just going to talk about existing risk assessments. As I say, risk assessments often have a way of interacting between each other. So whatever you're going to do, you need to look at your risk assessments and review them at all times. And this goes for any risk assessment. So this is not COVID related, this is any risk assessment. They always need to be reviewed because things change. Things change. So look at your risk assessment and see how COVID-19 risk assessments interact. So things like fire risk assessments, you've changed where people interact, how people interact, where they can go, what doors are opening, how they open doors. That changes your fire risk assessment. Legionnaires, especially if offices or sites have been closed for a long time, that may have an effect. Lone working from home, especially if you're now moving into a part home working, part lone working, people not as interactive or working on different floors or different areas, you're going to have to look at your lone working and working from home policies, as well as things like GDPR policies, especially if people are taking laptops home and stuff like that, which you may not have had before, or using electronic means for paperwork. How does that affect your GDPR policies? And the final one, as I say, mental health is extremely important. It's a time of change. It's a time that people get affected by mental health. And the key thing here is not knowing. The unknown is what actually affects people more than anything. The unknown, the times of change. So if you can tell them and explain exactly what's going on, they're more likely to be happy. They're more likely to have less mental health issues, and also more likely to follow the procedures you put in place without any real issues. I'm now going to kind of take any questions. I don't think we've got any at the moment. I'll sort of, I know time is also, we've kind of gone on a little bit longer with a couple of the questions we had, so time is pushing on. But if you've got any questions, more than happy to answer any that you've got on any of these aspects. We are running further workshops as well. We've got one tomorrow, again, on factories and the workplace. So if anybody wants to come on to that one and ask any questions, more than happy to answer those tomorrow on different aspects as well. As I say, this was funded by the Humber Growth Hub, and I'm going to say here, there is a lot of support available. Businesses are having changed. No matter what business you are affected by COVID. And businesses change on a day-to-day basis anyway. The local growth hubs, Humber Growth Hub, the website, humbergrowthhub.org, I was about to say is there in front of you, but I don't think it is something that you need to contact and just see what's available. It's worthwhile to see what's available. So do contact the Humber Growth Hub and see what's available. There are other workshops that are running on various different things through the Grow Your SME program. So finally, just checking the questions again. I don't think there are any questions. I will say thank you very much for attending today. I also thank Adam for attending and giving such detailed information on the PPE side of things and sort of what's needed there. But if anybody's got any further questions, do contact the Humber Growth Hub, and I thank you very much.